section is on difficult histories and new context. So we have two speakers for this panel. The first is Ben Huntley. Right, you're first, right? Yes. Joe. Apologies. The first is Joe Baker, who is a Heritage Project intern for our tower, discovering and reconnecting Beckford's Tower and landscape, a Bath Preservation Trust, and a Public History graduate from the University of York. He will be speaking on Power and Privilege, Reinterpretation of a Slave Trader at Beckford's Tower and Museum. Then we will have Ben Huntley, who is a master's student at the University of York studying public history, where his main area of interest has been the intersection between myth and history. He also recently presented a paper at the Commemorating the Second World War in the Young 21st Century Conference at York. He will be speaking on Rehabilitating the Past, Bomber Command and Memories of the Second World War. So without further ado, we will begin with Joe, and then we will have questions at the end.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming to the talk. My talk is called Power and Privilege, the Reinterpretation of a Plantation at Beckford's Tower Museum. I just wanted to take the time at the start to say that please be aware that this talk does include discussions of enslavement, exploitation and prejudice. So if it feels like this is not a comfortable space for anyone at any time, then feel free to leave at any time. And I know that Kirsty's doing a very nice presentation upstairs, which seems really interesting and quite fun to be missing that anyway. But so moving on, the project is called. Wait, if I can that. So the focus of the project is called Our Tower, Reconnecting Beckford's Tower and Landscape for All, and it's really about the attempts. Well, my presentation anyway is about the attempts of reinterpreting the previous owner of the building, William Beckford. So just as a brief overview of William Beckford as a person. At 9 years old, he inherited his father's fortune, making him one of the richest people in Georgian England. And with that, he had a very privileged education and upbringing, and at 21 years old, he gained notoriety after he wrote the Gothic novel Vathek. With that, he was an avid art collector, reader and designer, and by the time of his death, he had a collection of over 11,000 books, which he claimed to have read every single copy. And he also commissioned two buildings, which is Fonthill Abbey in Wiltshire and Beckford's Tower in Bath, which we'll be discussing about today. But the important thing to note is that all this power and privilege and wealth is directly linked to the ownership of plantations in Jamaica and the subjugation of thousands of enslaved people suffered. And this is a story that hasn't been told at the museum previously, so this is kind of the main impetus of what we're doing. So, just some background about the extent of the wealth. This was Fonthill Abbey that he had designed and commissioned. This was a private residence just for himself. And when he sold it for about the equivalent of now about £30 million. So and then it collapsed 2 years afterwards. A bit of a background now on the Beckfords and transatlantic slavery. So there was 4 generations of the Beckfords that were plantation owners on Jamaica, starting from his great-grandfather Peter Beckford in 1661. His father was known as Alderman Beckford, and he used the money from the family to create a political platform for the family. As he was twice Lord Mayor of London, and he was presented himself as a hero of liberty, while at the same time forcing people into slavery, stripping them of their names, and giving them the surname Beckford. So by the time that Alderman Beckford passed away in 1770, William Beckford inherited 13 plantations and 3,000 enslaved people, and he never once visited Jamaica. He was an absentee planter. Moving on from that, in 1833, when the Slavery Abolition Act was passed, he claimed around £12,803, which is equivalent to 1.3 million today, in compensation, and that value was the equivalent of the 1,860 enslaved people on his plantations at that time. As you can see from the top right, there's a clear link between this involvement in the slave trade and the ability to build Beckford's Tower. As in 1790, he was quoted as saying that one of my new estates in Jamaica brought me £7,000 last year, so I'm growing rich and mean to build towers. But this is also another important part of the project, is that the name Beckford, of Beckford's Tower that we're representing, just does not die just with the white British Beckfords. In 1840, the Anti-Slavery Society held a convention which invited delegates from across free slaves from a lot of the plantation islands and in the West Indies. And one of those delegates was Henry Beckford, who was now a freed slave from one of the Beckford plantations. So this is a main part of the story, and that highlights the project's aim is to tell the history of all the Beckfords, and it is paramount that all of his collections and be interpreted through the lens of where this wealth is coming from. So now just a bit of background into the project. So this title is taken from our interpretation strategy, which is our tower to take in the view from all perspectives. So a bit of background about the tower itself. It was built between 1826 and 1828, and it was a private retreat used by Beckford to house his extensive art and book collections. It was never lived in, but it was built just to kind of be a retreat from his house in Bath, and he built a kind of mile-long ride from his house in Bath, which was completely private, up into the tower. And just so you know that the tower is just off one of the busiest roads in Bath, so it was very much making it a very public, private place that only he could use. And his tomb, which was designed by Beckford himself before he died, was in the grounds, which are now a cemetery. And now moving on to the project, the tower is now owned and run by the Bath Preservation Trust, which is who I'm representing today, and was taken over in 1995. But in 2019, it was placed in the National At-Risk Register just for the capital, just for the tower was just in a really poor condition structurally. But after that, we were able to receive funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and that was to repair the tower and renovate the interior, and also reconnect the tower to its lost historical context and landscape. So through this, what I'll be talking about today specifically is talking you through our interpretation strategy. Because this, very, very paramount to try and bring this mission to life and better interpret the link through multiple avenues that I'll be talking through you today. But the main kind of impetus and point of view that we're kind of trying to get across in the museum is that we're trying to invite multiple perspectives into the narrative through a layered interpretation that caters to diverse audiences and adopting a tone of voice which is allowing for many points of view rather than the traditional expert voice. So firstly, I'm going to be talking you through the interior. So as well as the exterior is being completely renovated, the interior of the tower is being completely redesigned. As you can see from the map here on the far right, it's quite an awkward space for a museum. So on that, from where that number 2 is, that is where the museum lies on just that one side. So there is only kind of 2 main rooms that we are using for an interpretation space. And for a long time, it's been this mix between a historic house and a museum. So through the project, the museum has been completely renovated to be a purpose-built museum space. And with that, a lot of the investment is in the infrastructure to be able to better interpret Beckford's involvement in slavery in the right way. So as I can show you from our before and after, this was the drawing room, one of the two main interpretation rooms that we'll have in the museum. And this was before the project started. And now this is what it will look like afterwards. We're having a lot more of kind of like display cases and a lot more ways to kind of succinctly curate responses to specific themes, which means that we're better able to kind of talk about his links to the transatlantic slave trade, better and in the right way, really. And another investment of that is the signage that's going on inside the tower. So really, as you can see, everything is held together by brass magnets, which is the point is that all the labelling that's inside all of these cases is really easily flexible and interchangeable. So with that, it means that we can be flexible to potential changes and challenges in our approach and be able to kind of cater to kind of what is more appropriate down the line. It's just making sure that that investment means that this is kind of really only the start of what we're doing when the museum reopens in 2024. So moving on, this is just an outside of the landscape map. As you can just see, there's Beckford's Tower right at the top there, and then there's Lansdowne Cemetery, which isn't owned by the tower, but owned by the council. This kind of white area at the bottom is the pallets, which we have recently bought, so we kind of have more space in the landscape to do more interpretation. And all of these certain like notes here are the external signage points that are going to be added, which aren't there at the moment. So really, with the landscape, the increased external signage has been really great to kind of lengthen the amount of interpretation that we can do, but it's also giving every visitor a chance to not come in. What I mean by that is if you can see from the label that's there on the side, everything before that will have a trigger warning or kind of a warning of what is going to be talked about in the museum. So it's really making it space that we don't want to confront people with this history if they're not comfortable being in that space. So it's really kind of making sure you're safeguarding people before they come to the museum. And although it really seems kind of counterintuitive to something that kind of really survives on that money that's coming in, that is more important really for what we're trying to do. As I was talking about the paddocks that we've now bought, yeah, these are now in the landscape and they're creating more space for us to host events and activities, which is what we're doing now that the tower's been closed recently. So we've been doing some conservation activities with for free school, like summer activities for families. And also with this way to kind of cater for a wider audience, because of the tower has got a lot of stairs and you can't actually get into the museum without taking a flight of stairs. It's not really accessible for some people that do have those accessibility needs. So in the landscape, we've got level pathways and level access into the section of the tower, which we're calling the East Vault, which means we have a space now that we can kind of cater for visitors' accessibility needs. And another main point is that we're part of the ride that I was talking about earlier that he used to take up to the tower. We're reopening a hidden grotto tunnel that was used by Beckford. So pretty much he built a grotto tunnel underneath the public footpath so he didn't have to see anyone coming up to the tower every day. Yeah, pretty much. Yes, so moving on to the digital aspect of our interpretation, and it's a kind of part of the layered interpretation that we're trying to achieve. We've been working closely with two companies which are working in collaboration called Curio and Calvium, and they're creating a digital interpretation in the landscape and within the tower. So Calvium are producing an experience platform which will host on an app, which will kind of host extra interpretation and material, as well as kind of audio tours in the landscape as well. And Curio are creating VR and AR experiences through the pictured AR goggles that we'll be using at the tower. So now that we're not we'll be a historic house, using these goggles you'll be able to recreate some of these old interiors in front of your eyes. And it's also using digital as a way of accessible interpretation. So we kind of have this digital more paramountly in the East Vault. So it's really for people that if they can't have access into the tower, they have kind of this level of interpretation that everyone has access to, and a little bit extra for them that's kind of making it worth for them to come to the museum really and learn about this, learn about what we're trying to do. So moving on to another layer of our interpretation strategy, the co-production has been really, really essential to what we're trying to do. Specifically, this first example, to expand from our traditional expert voice, this example is a performance that we're in collaboration with State of Trust to produce called Cane Warriors. And this is based off a novel by Alex Wheatle, which centres around Tacky's Rebellion. And this is an uprising of enslaved people in Jamaica in 1760. And one of the plantations, which was the Esser Estate, was a Beckford-owned plantation, and a lot of enslaved people from that plantation were involved in these protests and in this rebellion. So yeah, we've been working with a place called State of Trust, and they're producing a dark performance of Cane Warriors, with the first of which will be at Beckford's Tower. I just wanted to point out that that first photo at the top is a State of Trust dancer who was dancing on top of the tomb of William Beckford, as they were doing they had a performance previously called about Samuel Coleridge, so they did called Coleridge Unbound, and it was a really powerful piece, and it really kind of sowed the seeds for wanting to do this with them afterwards. Another section of this co-production that we're trying to achieve is a lot through our community engagement as well. So firstly, it's been really essential for us because we're coming from a team where most of us don't have the direct lived experience that we're trying to talk about history. So it's been really crucial for us. Firstly, we have our community advisory panel, who are local community organisations and leaders who meet regularly to discuss a lot about our interpretation of the tower. And we see them really much as a critical friend to the tower that advises on all aspects of the project and has a really big influence on the decisions made about interpreting the story of William Beckford. So yeah, they've been really crucial, and to be part of this project you can really see the big impact that they have been able to have on a lot of the interpretation that's now going to the museum, which is really great to see. And they also challenge us from that different perspective. So then moving on to a final thing that I'll talk about today is our objects in focus that we'll be implementing. We have been and we'll be continuing to implement in the museum. So each year we'll be working with a different local community group to choose an object in the collection and have a creative response to it, e.g. whether that's a painting or a formal mosaic. So this picture on the side is an example of the last objects in focus that we had, which was made by the Black Families Education Support Group. And they, instead of picking a part of the collection, chose the tower really in general, and a lot of it is about the kind of the views from the windows into the tower from the outside perspective. and using that banner down through the staircase to kind of symbolise what the banners mean to forms of protest, which is really, really incredible to be a part of that. And yeah, this is something we'll be continuing afterwards. So finally, I just kind of want to leave with this emphasis that reopening in March 2024, this is really only the beginning of what we're doing. A lot of the investment in the infrastructure means that we're still learning a lot more and still not really conforming to that March 2024, everything has to be done and settled. It's very much like we now have the right way and impact to be able to talk about more different stories about Beckford and also the wider Beckfords that we really, really want to try and represent. So I just wanted to leave that we have 3 webinars at the moment with the Cane Warriors team, which we have 2 more left. One of them is about the historic buildings in the slave trade, and then one of them is about State of Trust and their interpretation of Cane Warriors dance theatre. So yeah, if this is of any interest to any of you, please feel free to sign up, and if you want to learn any more, please visit our website. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Hello everyone, my name is Ben. Thank you very much for having me here today. It's been a fabulous day so far. We're nearly at the end of the talk, so just keep breathing, we'll get there. I'm delighted to be here talking to you about my dissertation topic, which I handed in earlier this week, which is how RAF Bomber Command from the Second World War is remembered in 21st century Britain. Now, let me start off by saying that memory is unusual. Remembering is certainly not the norm. As Astrid Earle describes it, memory of an event is an island in a vast sea of forgetting. The sad truth is, you will forget the majority of the things that have been said today. You will remember mostly those moments that have particularly resonated with you. On a larger scale, collective memory becomes formed from these resonant moments that have particular significance for a community or for a group. Expanding to an even larger scale, national memory of an event or time is often subject to mythologization. Now, the term myth can be controversial. In wider usage, myth generally denotes some sort of untruth. Within historical study, however, myth has a more multifaceted definition. It incorporates those events that take on an identificatory role. Alida Assmann, she summarises that myth, in this sense, is a foundational history that possesses a lasting significance whose force is not neutralised by historicisation. It keeps the past alive in contemporary society and gives that society an orientation for the future. Now, this does not necessitate a falsification of history. Indeed, as Mark Connolly argues, the British myth of the Second World War is fundamentally based on truth. In short, myths do not destroy history, they merely simplify it. For 21st century Britain, the national myth of the Second World War still occupies a position of importance. Mark Connolly provides an excellent summary of this myth in his work, We Can Take It, which I highly recommend. This picture is emblematic of Britain's self-perception, bravely soldiering on with a cup of tea in less than ideal circumstances. Connolly sums up the myth as revolving around what he calls the triptych of 1940, which is namely the evacuation of Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, and the Blitz. Now, these 3 moments share crucial unifying factors, namely they represent Britain standing alone, fighting against the evil forces of fascism as they come knocking at the door. Crucially, these events were all times when Britain was under attack. The British Armed Forces positioned themselves as a defensive force. The organisation overseeing them is the Ministry of Defence. RAF Bomber Command, which controlled the bomber forces of the British Air Force from 1936 to 1968, sits somewhat incongruously within this narrative of defence. They were the primary offensive force against Germany for the majority of the war. And from 1942, their main area of attack was area attacks against cities. They were actually specifically targeting civilians and the factories within cities. It also had an extremely high attrition rate. Volunteers of Bomber Command, the attrition rate was around 50%. So 50% of all those who volunteered for Bomber Command died while they were serving. In this talk, I want to outline how Bomber Command has been remembered since the end of the war and what forces are at work to try and rehabilitate and realign this memory within the main national narrative that is summed up by the myth. Now, the most famous and unproblematic raid in Bomber Command's history is undoubtedly Operation Chastise, which you probably know as the Dams raid immortalised in the Dam Busters film. It's unsurprising that this holds such an important place because it featured a crack bomber squadron flying deep into enemy territory, blowing up German dams with a brand new and jolly ingenious new weapon, flooding the Ruhr Valley and severely damaging German war production. It also featured the enigmatic Guy Gibson, who statistically should have died 3 times before the raid even took place. So it ticks all the boxes for a great British war story. The film feeds this mythologisation. The civilian collateral damage of over 1,200 dead is not mentioned at all. Instead, it shows a mass of rushing water once the dam is breached, there is a swelling soundtrack, there is destruction of farmland and factories. There are 4 Germans in the entire film, and they are only shown running away from the water, but don't worry, they escape. Such is the strength of feeling around this raid that the BBC earlier this year had to issue an apology because a presenter dared to call it the infamous Dam Busters raid. The corporation's executive complaints unit apologised for the, quote, blunder, saying that though the raid is not without its critics, the use of the word infamous with its strongly negative connotations was not appropriate. This level of idolatry is usually reserved for Fighter Command, which is the other side of the RAF's coin in the Second World War. So they were the people in charge of the Spitfires, the Hurricanes and so on that fought in the Battle of Britain. This is the Battle of Britain Memorial in Capel-le-Fern in Kent. As many historians have pointed out, these were among the least problematic figures in the war. They were brave, they were doing their bit, they were fighting one-on-one in a chivalric fashion. They were visible from the ground, but far enough away that the full horrors of war were spared. The public never saw them. The most famous weapon wielded by Fighter Command, the Spitfire, has become an icon and a cuddly toy. And there's an article by Catherine Palmer and Geoffrey Bird which explores this, which I very much recommend. The point is that Bomber Command veterans have often felt a distinct separation from this. I mentioned that the most famous raid is Operation Chastise. The most infamous is surely the bombing of Dresden in February 1945. Dresden is now much more than a city. It is a synonym for what happens to a city under attack. Max Hastings calls it a lasting blot on the Allies' conduct of the war. It was after the destruction of the city became more widely known that the political establishment, led by Winston Churchill, began to distance itself from the actions of Bomber Command, which they had previously heartily supported. During his victory speech, Churchill mentioned every branch of the armed forces and what they had contributed to victory apart from Bomber Command. They did not receive a specific campaign medal. They instead received the Home Defence Medal, an award deemed wholly inappropriate, as they weren't a defensive force at all. So why they got the Home Defence Medal kind of confused quite a lot of veterans. It was Bomber Command's attacks on cities from 1942 onwards that caused the controversy. They were launched by a 1,000 bomber raid on Cologne, which was the idea of Sir Arthur Harris, who we'll come on to later. It was not uncommon to see raids of several hundred planes flying over and all attacking the same city. It was Bomber Command's lack of technological ability that triggered this change in policy. For the majority of the war, they were unable to hit anything smaller than a fairly sizable town. At the time, this switch was viewed as a great success. Apart from anything else, the morale boost of knowing that the fight was being taken back to the enemy was vital. Germany was being given a taste of what it was dishing out. As one veteran said, the RAF didn't do anything the Luftwaffe didn't do first, they just did it better. As the temporal distance from the war increased, space opened up for a discussion of morality. The use of nuclear weapons on Japan in 1945 demonstrated the devastating power that aerial attack could now deploy. Noble Frankland, who was one of the official historians of the Second World War, argued in 1965 that it was a reaction to Bomber Command's action in the Second World War that had been the primary catalyst for the anti-nuclear campaign. Thanks in part to images from the Korean and Vietnam Wars of what bombers were now inflicting on civilians, by the 1970s, opinion about Bomber Command had swung to the extreme negative end of the spectrum. The TV series The World at War had barely a kind word to say about it in their episode about Bomber Command. Bizarrely, the most effusive support comes from Albert Speer, who you may or may not know was the Nazi armaments minister, who congratulated Bomber Command in the episode on what a good job they'd done at destroying Hamburg. Operation Chastise, that most revered raid of all, remember it's famous, it's not infamous, is referred to as partially successful. A large portion of the episode is devoted to very graphic descriptions of the bombing of Hamburg, in which 40,000 people died in truly horrifying circumstances. The episode doesn't mention the context. It doesn't mention that Hamburg is a major port, it's a transport hub, it had a number of factories, it came after propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels' infamous Sportpalast speech, in which he mobilised Germany for total war. You could argue that that made every citizen a target. I'm of course not saying that this justified the severity of the attack, but I think it's interesting that this hugely influential documentary, a gateway to understanding the war for the general public, didn't tackle the subject in a more even-handed way. It was focused purely on the negative aspects. Now, after the death of Sir Arthur Harris, Bomber Command's Commander-in-Chief, staunchest supporter and advocate for area bombing, after he died in 1984, veterans decided to try and redress the balance. The Bomber Command Association was established. Their first major fundraising effort was for this statue of the leader at the RAF Church at St Clement Danes in London. It was unveiled in 1992 by the Queen Mother on the 50th anniversary of the first 1,000 bomber raid on Cologne. Now, unsurprisingly, in a post-Cold War world, with a newly reunified Germany as an ally, this prompted significant debate, not least from the Mayor of Cologne, who asked the Queen Mother not to attend. It also allowed debate about the role of Bomber Command in the Second World War to resurface, but crucially, to attach itself to Harris. The plaque on the statue states that it is in memory of Harris and all those who served under him, but Harris still remains as the figurehead. With his nickname of Bomber Harris, he is, in the public's eye, the figure most culpable for the more distasteful elements of Bomber Command's war efforts. Now, this frees up the aircrew and other personnel for more reverential treatment within national memory. From the 1990s, veterans began to retire, and with more free time, they began to reflect on their experiences. There was an explosion of memoirs released by veterans who wanted to feed their side of the story into the wider collective memory of the campaign. This was a defence against a perceived top-down attack on the memory of what they had achieved and sacrificed. Memorials continued to be built, most notably this one, the RAF Bomber Command Memorial in Green Park in London, unveiled in 2012, and the International Bomber Command Centre in Lincoln, which henceforth I'll call the IBCC, which was opened in 2018. The centre of the Green Park Memorial features a sculpture of a bomber crew. As you can see, they are all traditionally handsome, mostly looking to the sky, the figure on the far right looking at the ground with a contemplative, I can never say that word, expression. There are no smiles to be seen on any of their faces. They all look fairly solemn, stoic, resilient, ready to do their duty no matter what the cost. This is an expression familiar to most figures on 20th century war memorials. On the left-hand wall, there is a quotation from Winston Churchill from 1940, which reads, "The fighters are our salvation, but the bombers alone provide the means of victory." Now, this does not disenfranchise fighter command of their place within the national myth. It re-establishes the link between the two halves of the RAF's defence and attack commands, creating an equivalency of achievement between the two. Harris and the controversy, interestingly, are not included at all. The situation is rather more complex at the IBCC, which is a site which features a memorial and a museum. The main exhibit features a typical day in the life of a bomber crew, incorporating feelings of tension and fear experienced before and during a raid. There are also sections in the upstairs gallery devoted to the British and German experience of bombing and being bombed, accompanied by sounds of bombs exploding. There is even analysis of the legacy of Bomber Command up to the 21st century. This site has to include the impact of the bombing campaign, which allows space for both bravery and victimhood to flourish together. However, the visitor's visit remains highly orchestrated. This sculpture is at the front. I'll be honest, when I parked, I thought it's strange to have a sculpture of a Lancaster dropping bombs. It is in fact a memorial to Operation Manna, which was in 1945. The RAF bomber crews dropped 7,000 tons of food into Nazi-occupied Netherlands. Before you can access either the museum or the memorial, you are already guided towards a more positive interpretation of Bomber Command. So what has prompted the shift to a grander, more positive memory of Bomber Command? I would argue the main force at work here is time. According to Jan and Elida Assmann, collective memory has what they call a specific temporal horizon of 80 to 100 years. After this, it dissolves and is replaced by new memory. We are currently in the 80th anniversary cycle of the Second World War. We are right on the cusp of this potential dissolving of memory. The last dam buster died last year, aged 101. We will very soon be left with nothing but memories of those who served in Bomber Command, which was transmitted intergenerationally. There is a palpable sense of this fear of memory fading at the IBCC. The memorial itself is made from a material which has decayed into this beautiful orange colour. And it will not decay any further. It is a controlled fading up to a point, much like the IBCC is attempting to mitigate the decay of memory of Bomber Command. The walls of names, which you can see all around the spire, are a memorial to the 55,000 or so aircrew who died volunteering for Bomber Command. Several of them have poppies next to their name. You can't quite see them, but they are there, I promise. Including one next to William Huntley's name, who is my great-uncle. I did not bring the poppy that is next to his name. It was handed to me by the tour guide, who practically insisted I place it in the hole next to his name. There is an opportunity for a fee to honour a person by adding them to the list of names memorialised at the annual school's Remembrance Service. While the museum does offer some insight into the history of the bombing campaign, the memorial, which is free to access, unlike the museum, interestingly, remains the main focus of the site. Exploring the history of Bomber Command feels voluntary, remembering those who died feels compulsory. I go into much more detail about memory theory in my dissertation, including an investigation into how family memory like this interacts with issues of national and collective memory, which I'll gladly share with you if you would like me to. Not right now, it'll take a week. But to conclude this brief overview, however, the most recent attempts to realign Bomber Command with national memory of the Second World War appear to have been successful, and symbolic rituals of commemoration may help to concretise this new position. A continued focus on raids that fit the national myth of the Second World War may also help secure this memory more neatly. It is, of course, only with the passing of time that we'll be able to see whether these techniques will be able to withstand the predicted dissolving of these memories. Thank you very much.
Alrighty, well, we have about 15-20 minutes to take questions. Joseph is going to walk around with the microphone, so if you have a question, just put your hands up. He will come and give it to you so that we can get your voice and hear it down here and on the computer. So if anyone has any questions, please let us know.
Thank you both for your presentations. They're both really brilliant and stimulated lots of ideas, and yeah, really great. This is a question for Joe. I just wanted to ask about if the Trust is in contact with any of the descendants of Beckford, both like descendants of the sort of Beckford family and also those who were given that surname. Yeah, I just wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So we do not have any contact with any of the white British Beckfords anymore. They're kind of the direct line from William Beckford and his family has kind of died out. The only kind of white British Beckfords that are around are kind of from illegitimate lines from like previous relationships. So that we don't have any direct contact with Beckfords, white British Beckfords. But we are actively in consultation and working with the historian Robert Beckford, and he's also trying to kind of put us in contact with more families in the UK that do have the surname Beckford still. And part of that interpretation, as part of the transatlantic slave trade, is that we are producing a film at the moment. We're in the beginning stages of that we'll kind of have on a loop during the on the museum, which is Consoli, which is going to be talking about like that impact and the kind of their personal perspective from being kind of descended from people who were enslaved on Beckford plantations. So.
Thank
thank you both so much. I've got another question for Joe. You mentioned about the dance project that's going on. I just wondered if you could say anything more about why that specific medium was used. It could have been sort of more acting style, it could have been spoken word poetry. There's so many different sort of performing art forms that it could have been chosen. Any just thoughts on why dance and anything you sort of hoped specifically to come out of it?
Yeah, sure. It doesn't see it, because when I joined, it was something that was kind of in the process already, and within my first few weeks, they had already been working with State Trust to be doing a performance of Colin John Bound, which was a lot about his poetry, which was really brilliant and breathtaking, and I think that original performance really put into perspective how powerful that type of art can be in those spaces that does have that legacy. And State of Trust were really keen because they had been kind of in conversation with Alex Wheatle to do a performance kind of completely separate from Beckford's Tower in the beginning, kind of didn't kind of come through us both, but it were kind of through having that first performance, it kind of came together as like a really ideal way to kind of increase that interpretation of Taki's Rebellion, especially in the museum. There's been a really, really great like collaboration with them, and because they've also, as well as because as like museum professionals, we're not doing anything towards the dance, so like it's completely State of Trust. But we kind of did it as a joint bid to the Heritage Fund, and managed to get funded through that way. They have been great because they've also been going into a lot of local schools in Bath and doing like workshops about the dance performance. I think it was kind of in general, it's a new way for us, especially to kind of interpret the transatlantic slavery kind of outside of that kind of academic voice that kind of has to come through sometimes when we're coming from a different perspective. It's been really, really brilliant, so I'm really excited to see what comes out at the end.
Okay, Joseph has a question for us.
So this is a question for Joe. You talked about using AR and VR in the museum. So I've just finished my dissertation on using sort of technology, not quite AR and VR, but technology in museum spaces. And you mentioned about accessibility for an audience, but how accessible has it been using that technology for the museum, for the tower itself? Because I know it can be quite a complicated, complicated thing to use and access often for museum groups, especially smaller museums.
It's a really exciting opportunity to be able to work with Zubicuri to kind of do those things, but it's really new to us because the museum at the moment is closed, so we haven't actually, it's not been implemented into the museum as of yet. We're still in the middle of testing and kind of building those experiences as well. It's definitely something that's come up in our meetings with Zubicuri because it's new to us as the tower to be able to have access through the funding that we've received to be able to do this and kind of pitch that, because that was my first day on the internship, was kind of sitting in on their interview panel for the tenders for the digital interpretation they were going to do. It's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out, because from being in those meetings with Zubicuri to kind of talk through the accessibility as a way to use this digital interpretation, it's very much being, at the same time, it's really great that they be able to use that experience to see stuff that is in the tower. At the same time, it could be really, really overstimulating for some people to use that. So at the same time, it's pairing the digital interpretation that way with a lot of we have a tactile model of the tower, which is going to be implemented at the bottom, and we're going to have kind of tactile guidebooks as well, which is all being produced at the same time. It's been 15 minutes, but I could talk about this project for hours, because there's so many different avenues that we're trying to go through. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. But that's been a key thing with the AR and VR experiences, is that they're really easy to use, because it is literally like using a pair of binoculars. Like, you've got that, there's two buttons, like a green and a red button to start it and stop it, and then you have that access to that experience. But there's still work that we need to do about kind of thinking about if people can't hold up goggles, then that's kind of another way that they can't access that interpretation. So it's really like, as well as what we're trying to do with the transatlantic slave trade and about a lot of that interpretations, that this is really still only the beginning of the process. Like, we're still learning a huge amount, and all of that by having the experience platforms that we can add to constantly. Like, after the end of their project and their involvement, we have access to the backend that we can add more content and change content. So it's more of the fact that we have it, and then we know through that experience what we need to change, and it's nice to be able to be flexible that way.
This is for Ben. So when thinking about like the multiplicity of historical narratives with the new veterans, memoirs, how do you, or have you seen a trend of how those narratives get titrated down in a new mythos creation, or how do they like choose one singular narrative for like the new myth that's born?
Yeah, it's a good question, because the memoirs that came out from the mid-90s onwards were quite clearly written from a perspective of, we feel like we have been neglected for the last 50 years. We've not been part of the story. In fact, one of them starts with the dedication is something, words to the effect of, this book is dedicated to the 55,000 men who gave their lives so that the current generation can question the morality of what we did. So that's definitely where it came from, was as a pushback against the wider story. And then the 2012 memorial, the one in London, was the Bomber Command Association. They financed that as well. They raised a lot of money. Weirdly, Robin Gibb, lead member of the Bee Gees, was like the biggest single donator of anyone, and he really pushed for it as well. So it's all of what you've seen, the memorials, have all come from veteran groups, or groups from Lincolnshire who want their story more told. And because there hasn't been any sort of pushback against that, they've been, just generally speaking, the Harris statue being the exception, they have been accepted into the story. So they've kind of written their way back into the story. And by having things like poppies, having the national services of remembrance and so on, those really, they are set in stone that in Britain, this is how we remember the war dead. End of discussion. So to incorporate those into the memorials as well, loops it really nicely back into the story.
I have a question for Ben about going off of the point of incorporating different perspectives about the media. And you said that in the last year, the BBC described it as infamous. They found that to be negative, so they went back on their statement. With what you're saying about changing memories and the future of media that's going to be created, such as movie or TV show interpretations of these stories, do you think that it will go down trends where they try and find those other perspectives that don't necessarily look at it as positively, or do you think there's still a belief that it needs to be viewed positively for the time being?
That's a really interesting question if we widen out and look at what Germany's doing, because they have, from reunification onwards, have been grappling, someone said it earlier, I can't remember who, but they've been grappling with how to deal with the negative elements of what they did in the Second World War. And from the 90s onwards, there was this shift into Germans allowing themselves to be thought of as victims of the war. And there was a TV show in 2004 called Dresden, in which the RAF Bomber Command are the bad guys. And that's really interesting. And what's fascinating about that is it was deeply controversial in Germany. Even Germany was saying, no, but the RAF were the good guys, but they annihilated the city. How can that be? I think as you move away from the kind of existential dread of the Second World War is happening right now, and we don't know how it's going to end, as you move away from that, the space opens up to get more emotional and less cold, militaristic view of what's happened. There is more space because there's less threat. So you can look at the emotional impact of these various things. I mean, if you look at, it's not Second World War, it's First World War, but All Quiet on the Western Front, one of the extraordinary films from last year. That was a really interesting example of, I would argue there were no sort of good or bad guys in that film, with the exception of officers versus soldiers. But even then, the people in control were the people who were pushing to end the war and end the carnage and so on. So there does seem to be a bit of a move to a more emotional storytelling of conflict in general. So I suspect that trend will continue. Whether we get another one that incorporates the experience of the terror of the bombers flying, that incorporates the civilians living under the bombs, that incorporates the fighters who are being... Whether you get one that incorporates the fact that everyone was terrified of everyone else, I doubt it, but it would be fun. It would be quite fun to try and make that work.
My question was slightly answered by yours, Hope, but that's absolutely fine. I was just really intrigued. You mentioned about this sort of 80-year marker that we're very much at the cusp of, and I just wondered if you had any ideas about where's this going to go moving forward. Is it going to be, the domain of sort of quasi-fictionalized film and television productions? How is this memory going to live on? Because it's like, I remember my nana used to remember hearing the planes, because I'm from Lincolnshire and I actually live down the road from some of this stuff, and she remembered hearing the planes flying overhead when she was a kid, and we lost her last year. So I can really see how this generational memory is fading. I just wondered if you had any ideas about where's this going to go as we look to the future. What's going to happen to it? What do you think?
I think there is an attempt to keep it going. Mariana Hirsch and her concept of post-memory, of those memories that are transmitted so deeply into the next generation. So, for example, William Huntley, or Great Uncle Bill, as he is exclusively known in the family, died in 1944, right? None of us ever met him, but my aunt has taken it upon herself to do all kinds of memorial activities for him. She was so... When I sent that picture of his name with the puppet, she was so excited. It really meant a lot to her. And she has specifically said that the reason it matters to her is because she now has grandchildren, and she wants to try and transmit that on. I think it's really interesting that the Bomber Command Centre, if you pay to honour the person, as they call it, the name gets put in a school assembly. Now, if I paid to have Great Uncle Bill in it, the people reading out the name, they wouldn't have a clue who he was. They wouldn't, nothing at all. So I think there will be an element of that as it moves on. I think looking at the world of media, film, and so on and so forth, I think that will be the primary vector of it. I mean, you've already seen it in things like Dunkirk and so on. That got the film treatment for the first time. That might be a lie, maybe second time. So yeah, but there is more of a sense of we need to lock this in. We need to make, because as you say, the people who are my granny told me stories of living in London and hearing the V1s fly over, and as long as you could hear it, you were okay. It was when you heard it and it stopped, then you were in trouble. And it's those stories which I remember. She's been dead for 10 years now, but I still remember that story really clearly. So if I now can transmit that on, it won't mean as much, but it's still that tangible link.
So we have about 5 more minutes. If anyone else has a question, yes. So we'll do about 1 more question, and then we will break before the practitioner panel. Yes. Getting to that slide.
So this one's for Ben. I noticed you said that it seemed to be very quickly that even Churchill himself was kind of distancing himself from Bomber Command. Was there any sort of backlash to that in the British public, where they would have viewed what was being done in Germany as sort of revenge or sort of fair play due to the Blitz itself? Was there any kind of public outcry?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There was the Home Office did a lot of, I've forgotten what they're called now, I've been writing about them for 3 months and I've forgotten, doesn't matter, where they would ask members of the public sort of their opinion, and one of them that I thought was really telling after the firebombing of Hamburg was they said, we appreciate the need to liquidate Hamburg, but for God's sake, don't remind us of what we're doing. So it was during the war when it was, as I say, a real existential threat, because don't forget, the British soldiers were unceremoniously kicked out of continental Europe in 1940 and didn't get back until 1944, so that's 4 years of, there's not a huge amount we could do, and we are, as you say, under attack the whole time. What's interesting about 1945 is a lot of people will say, well, it was only 3 months before the end of the war that Dresden was attacked. We know that now, we didn't know it then. So it's really interesting. This Churchill, with his politician's hat on, clearly had caught wind of there was an election coming up and the war was going to end fairly soon. So he started this distancing. And there was an interesting moment when you get in 1946, you get the Nuremberg trials as they start going. You have Hermann Goering in the dock, who was in charge of the Luftwaffe, and the main thing that he was charged with was deliberately attacking cities. And then they very quietly dropped that bit because they thought, we did that as well, problem. So as footage from continental Europe came back to Britain and it was finally revealed and then peace came and everything was safe again, that was when the question started being raised. Even the Church of England supported the bombing campaign while it was going on, and then remarkably quickly turned their back on it once the war was over, which is the biggest problem veterans historically have had.
Alrighty, well it's 3:45 now, so we're going to take a quick break. If you guys have any more questions for these guys, you're welcome to come up to them during the break, ask them questions. I'm sure they would love to talk to you more, but we're just going to take a quick 5 to 10 minute break before we go into our practitioner panel, and then that will be the last thing that we have on the docket for today before the evening event. So you're free to go. Thank you guys very much.